Listen, picture this. You're a German officer in 1941. You just rolled over France in 6 weeks. You smashed Poland in 18 days. Your tanks were rattling down the Champs-Élysées. Then the Eastern Front started. And that place? That's hell. Honest, bloody, frozen hell. The Russians don't break like they taught you in the academy. They fight for every ditch, every basement. They counterattack when they have no shells left and no hope. You lose your friends by the thousand. And in the middle of all that, someone tells you, hey, in a year or two, we'll have to fight the Americans. The Americans? Seriously? Those guys who listen to that lousy jazz, watch Hollywood, and sell each other sandwiches? To give you a sense of just how arrogant the Germans were, here's a fact. In 1940, right after the fall of France, Hitler told his inner circle, America is a house of cards. One punch and it'll collapse. They have no Führer, no ideology, no army. He genuinely believed the US would fall apart at the first real military setback. Hitler called the US a nation of traitors, not warriors, traitors. People who know how to count dollars but don't know how to hold a rifle. And guess what? Almost the entire German high command bought into it. They genuinely laughed at America. Sure, they're rich. Sure, they've got a lot of gear, but they don't know how to fight and don't want to. Show them a little blood, and they'll run right back across the ocean to their supermarkets. Here's another fact. Armaments Minister Albert Speer wrote in his memoirs that Hitler once said at dinner that Americans wouldn't be able to mass-produce tanks because they lack the patience and discipline of the German worker. This was said by a man who, 3 years later, would watch the US produce 50,000 planes a year. 50,000. For comparison, Germany's peak yearly production was about 40,000, and that was in 1944, with factories running at max capacity under constant bombing. That belief cost the Third Reich everything. So why did they screw up so badly? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad intel. It was a systematic, ideological, almost religious self-deception. Let's break it down, because by the end of this, you'll understand one very uncomfortable truth about how big wars are actually won. Spoiler, it's not about bravery. It's about factories, ports, and the ability to learn from your screw-ups. The Americans could do that. The Germans couldn't. Here's the starting point. Nazi ideology. They had everything neatly sorted into boxes. Box number 1. Germany is a nation of warriors. We're forged in battle. We have Prussian discipline. We're ready to sacrifice. Fact. Nazi schools taught kids a poem that included the line, "Let the American be rich, but the German is strong in spirit." Money fades, but steel remains. Box number 2. America is a plutocracy, a country ruled by bankers, brokers, and factory owners. No single nation, no racial foundation, just a melting pot. No inner backbone. How can a country like that fight? They can only spend money. Before the war, Hitler kept saying American society was rotten with materialism, a fancy word for a simple idea. They love comfort too much and are terrified of losing their refrigerator. Here's a specific example. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, Hitler told his generals, America won't enter the war because Americans are too fat and lazy. They won't want to leave their couches. Yes, he actually said that, and the generals nodded along. Joseph Goebbels, that master of spin, ran with it. In his propaganda, America was a kingdom of softness. Jazz? Decadence. Hollywood? Moral decay. Ads, supermarkets, chewing gum? All proof that Americans couldn't handle hardship. German newspapers ran cartoons of a fat Uncle Sam with a cigar in his mouth, surrounded by dollars and hamburgers, trembling at the sight of a German soldier. A very convenient image. The problem was that the image was from the last century. Goebbels even issued a memo ordering newspapers to use the word plutocracy at least 5 times in every issue that mentioned the US. 5 times! You can picture the editors counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're done for today. And here's the first interesting fact they ignored. In 1940 and 1941, while America was still officially neutral, its industry was already switching to war production. Did you know that by the end of 1941, the US was building more planes than all the Axis countries combined? Specifically, in 1941, the US built about 19,000 planes. Germany built about 11,000, Japan about 5,000. One country was outproducing Germany and Japan together, and that wasn't even full mobilization. And Lend-Lease wasn't just helping out friends. It was a giant conveyor belt shipping tanks, fighters, canned food, barbed wire, gas, and truck tires to Britain and the Soviet Union. Everything needed for war. To give you context, over the course of the war, the US supplied over 22,000 tanks under Lend-Lease, almost 15,000 planes, more than 400,000 trucks. 400,000 trucks! That was practically the entire mobility of the Red Army. The Germans looked at this and said, "See, they're trading, businessmen. They haven't even started fighting and they're already profiting." They saw Lend-Lease not as a sign of future military power, but as proof of their theory. America is a wallet, not a fist. One German general called Lend-Lease the most expensive way to avoid a war. Man, was he wrong. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese smashed the American fleet. 8 battleships, nearly 200 planes, over 2,400 dead. You'd think the Germans would get worried. Instead, Berlin just shrugged. In the diaries of Halder, the head of the German General Staff, there are entries like this. "The American army has no experience. Their officers are dilettantes. Their soldiers aren't ready for heavy losses. The Red Army is the real enemy. The American is a tourist with a rifle." Funny, right? They actually believed the US couldn't build a million-man army capable of fighting on equal terms. Spoiler, they could. By 1945, the US Army had 8.3 million soldiers. 8 million! By that point, Germany was scraping together old men and kids for the Volkssturm. The Americans were young, well-fed, well-trained, and they had so much gear it would make your head spin. The US built nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks alone. For comparison, the most common German tank, the PZ-4, had about 8,500 made. Panthers? Around 6,000. Tigers? Less than 1,500. See the difference? 50,000 against 8. That's not a war, that's a beatdown. But let's dig deeper. Where did this contempt for American soldiers even come from? It wasn't from nowhere. The roots are in World War I. And here's a key fact that often gets missed. The US entered World War I in April 1917. By that time, Germany had been fighting France, Britain, and Russia for nearly 3 years. 3 years of carnage, trench warfare, Verdun, and the Somme. The American Expeditionary Force under General Pershing started arriving in late 1917, but didn't fight in large numbers until 1918. Yes, they played a role in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where over 1 million Americans fought. But German officers remembered something different. The Americans showed up when the outcome was already decided. Germany was choking under a blockade, the army was exhausted, revolution was brewing. And then fresh American regiments appear. The Germans told themselves, "We didn't lose because of their fighting ability. We lost because of the blockade and our own exhaustion." The Americans just tagged along. German textbooks between the wars wrote explicitly, American troops showed nothing exceptional. Their successes are explained only by their numbers and fresh reserves. Nothing about tactics, nothing about courage, just fresh reserves. That template got baked into their brains. After World I, the German Reichswehr studied the 1914-18 experience in obsessive detail. Every battle, every operation, and the conclusion was always the same. The main enemies were France, Britain, and the economic blockade. America was a secondary factor, no deep military tradition. Unlike the French with their centuries of war, or the British with their imperial experience. The Americans had none of that. Their army in 1917 was laughably small by European standards, about 130,000 men. They had to build it from scratch. A draft system, crash courses for officers, teaching trench warfare from the ground up. Here's a fact. When the Americans first arrived in France, French and British officers were shocked at their level. One French general said, "They're brave, but they don't even know the basics. They have to learn everything from scratch." The Germans remembered that and assumed it would always be true. They're not warriors, they're civilians in uniform on a crash course. 20 years passed. In the 1930s, the Wehrmacht was being built, trained, and sharpened. And still, they didn't see the US as a potential top-tier threat. America seemed far away, stuck in its isolationist shell, staying out of European affairs. The US Congress passed Neutrality Act after Neutrality Act. The most famous one, the Neutrality Act of 1937, directly banned selling weapons to warring nations. The Germans looked at this and thought, "See, we told you, they don't care about Europe, they'll just trade and stay out of the fighting." By 1941, the stereotype was locked in. In the last war, the Americans showed up late, fought for a short time, and didn't go through that multi-year survival school that European armies endured. So it'll be the same this time. They didn't stop to think that 20 years had changed America. Its industry had grown massively. It had an air force now. Its military had been studying and learning. No, for the Germans, the American soldier was frozen in 1918. Inexperienced, but rich. And that was the fatal mistake. Because the US of 1941 was not the Army of 1917. It was a country that in a few short years turned itself into the arsenal of democracy, a monstrous industrial machine capable of arming and training a multi-million-man army in 2 years. Think about these numbers. During the war, the US built over 300,000 planes. 300,000! More than Germany and Japan combined. Also 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 100,000 armored vehicles, 350,000 artillery pieces. And all of that had to be shipped across an ocean. The Germans couldn't even properly supply their divisions in Africa because the British kept sinking their ships in the Med. The German command was mentally stuck in the past. They were looking at America through 20-year-old glasses. And in war, betting on outdated ideas about your enemy is almost always a path to disaster. Always. Remember that. Then came North Africa, 1942 to 43, Operation Torch. The Americans landed in Morocco and Algeria. Fun fact, the first American unit to engage the Germans in this campaign was the 1st Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Byrd, later said, "We didn't even know what a German tank looked like in real life. We were taught from pictures." Facing them was the Africa Corps and Erwin Rommel himself, the Desert Fox. German units were battle-hardened veterans of France, the Balkans, and many of the Eastern Front. The Americans? Most of them were under fire for the first time. Another fact, the average age of an American soldier in Africa was 24, and many had never left their home country before. They arrived in the desert with tactics manuals in their pockets. February 1943, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was ugly. The Germans hit the U.S. Second Corps, commanded by General Lloyd Friedendahl, a man later called one of the worst generals in American history, and the Americans fell apart. Comms were spotty, commanders lost control, tanks were abandoned on the roads with full fuel and ammo. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We captured a supply dump with cookies and Coca-Cola. They have cookies even in combat. These aren't soldiers, they're tourists." Units retreated in chaos. American losses, about 10,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans were thrilled. "See, we told you, they can't fight. They panic at the first real breakthrough." Their reports described Americans as poorly trained, prone to panic, overly dependent on gear. One German commander wrote, "The American can't fight in close combat. He gets lost without artillery and air support." Another added, "They abandon perfectly good vehicles and run. These aren't soldiers, they're merchants in uniform." Some were even harsher. "The American army is a rabble that will scatter at the first serious offensive." But here's the thing. Kasserine wasn't a strategic disaster. Don't get me wrong, it was painful, it was embarrassing for the Americans, but it was a local defeat. And then, something happened that the Germans never expected. Instead of whining and retreating, the Americans learned. And they learned fast. Command of Second Corps was changed. The weak link, General Friedendahl, was sent to a training center, far from real combat. In his place came George Patton. That Patton, tough, ambitious, demanding.
Patton arrived and immediately laid down the law. All soldiers in full gear 24/7, iron discipline. Every officer responsible for coordinating with artillery and air. In 2 weeks, he turned a demoralized mob into a fighting force. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support was fixed. Intense training was run. New tactics were adopted. Just a few weeks later, in the next battles in Tunisia, American units fought completely differently. For example, at El Ghoutar, American artillery stopped German attacks with a precision the Germans didn't expect. One German officer said at the time, "They're shooting at our tanks like they're practice targets." But the Germans didn't notice, or they didn't want to, because admitting your enemy is learning means admitting that soon he'll be dangerous. And it was so much easier to keep believing the propaganda. And that brings us to the main event, the biggest piece of the puzzle. Without understanding the Eastern Front, you'll never understand why the Germans were so blind when it came to the Americans. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union. And this wasn't just war, it was a war of annihilation. Different rules, different cruelty. The German generals expected the Red Army to collapse in a couple of months. It didn't. Yes, in the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht bagged entire Soviet armies in cauldrons. Near Minsk, about 300,000 prisoners. Near Smolensk, another 300,000. Near Kiev, over 600,000. The largest encirclement in military history. It seemed like just a little more and the USSR would fall. But it didn't. The Red Army retreated, lost territory, lost millions, but kept fighting. Outside Moscow in December 1941, the Russians counterattacked and pushed the Germans back 100 to 250 kilometers. That was the first serious shock for the Wehrmacht. German losses near Moscow, over 400,000. More than the entire North African campaign over 2 years. Then Stalingrad. You know the story? 200 days of hell. Streets, factories, basements, a battle where every building became a fortress. Pavlov's house, a 4-story building held by a handful of Soviet soldiers for 58 days. The German Sixth Army, considered unbeatable, got trapped. Hitler forbade retreat. Soldiers died from hunger, cold, endless attacks. When Field Marshal Paulus surrendered in February 1943, Germany didn't just lose an army, it lost the myth of its invincibility. German losses at Stalingrad, about 800,000 dead, wounded, or captured. For comparison, total Wehrmacht losses in all of North Africa, about 200,000. See the difference? 1 Stalingrad equals 4 North Africas. Then Kursk, July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of tanks on both sides. The Germans had about 3,000 tanks and assault guns, including new Panthers and Ferdinands. The Soviets had over 5,000 tanks. The battle near Prokhorovka, where about 800 tanks clashed in a single day, is still debated. The Germans wanted revenge, to smash through, to turn the war around. They failed. The Red Army held, ground down the Wehrmacht's elite divisions, and went on the offensive. German losses at Kursk, about 200,000 men and over 1,000 tanks. After Kursk, German forces in the east only retreated, and they retreated with losses that could never be replaced. Now put yourself in the boots of a German soldier who went through all that. Stalingrad, Kursk, the Rzhev meat grinder, where Soviet losses were in the millions and German losses in the hundreds of thousands. That soldier saw Russians fight to the last bullet. He saw them counterattack when there was no hope. He saw them die rather than surrender. For him, war was mud, blood, frost, and endless exhaustion. Then someone tells him, hey, there's another front, the Americans. What Americans? Who are these people? They don't even know what real combat is. They have hot showers, chocolate rations, and Coca-Cola. Fact, American rations included toilet paper, cigarettes, chewing gum, coffee, and chocolate. German rations were mostly hardtack and sometimes canned meat. The Americans are fighting in Africa, in the desert, without the frozen hell or the mud.
Of course, to a German veteran of the Eastern Front, the Americans looked like kids playing at war. One German NCO, transferred from the East to Italy, wrote to his wife, "It's heaven here. Green grass, sun shining, and the Americans shoot so badly I thought it was fireworks at first." That psychological distortion was massive. The Wehrmacht developed a deep belief: the main enemy is in the East. That's where the war is decided. Everything else is secondary, a sideshow. The Germans missed one simple thing. While they were pouring everything into fighting the Red Army, the Americans were quietly building factories, training millions of soldiers, and preparing the invasion of Europe. And by the time that invasion came, the American army would have nothing in common with the inexperienced mob Rommel had rolled over at Kasserine. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Operation Overlord. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Get this scale: nearly 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 soldiers just on the first day. For comparison, the North Africa landings used about 500 ships. Normandy was 14 times bigger. German generals stared in disbelief. Where did all this come from? And the worst part, total Allied air supremacy. Any attempt to move German reserves during the day ended in mass casualties from airstrikes. You couldn't move a tank division because it would just get bombed to pieces on the road. In fact, when the German 2nd Panzer Division tried to move to the beach, it lost 70% of its vehicles to air attack before it ever saw an American soldier. The first fights in Normandy showed the Germans that times had changed. The Americans didn't panic anymore. They fought methodically, stubbornly, using overwhelming firepower. An attack went like this. First, artillery pounds the position for hours. Then airstrikes hit specific targets. Then infantry moves in with tank support. No fanatical charges, no whatever-it-takes frontal assaults, but brutally effective. And the damage they inflicted was massive. For example, in the battle for St. Lo, the Americans fired more artillery shells in a few weeks than the Wehrmacht produced in 6 months. That's not an exaggeration. Then came the breakout from Normandy. Summer 1944. American tanks and motorized infantry just exploded forward. They moved so fast that German units couldn't set up a defense. The Americans had so many trucks they could carry everything: ammo, fuel, spare parts, even ice cream. Fact: American logistics officers actually shipped ice cream to the front. The Germans, who hadn't seen decent coffee in years, were in shock. One German general wrote in his report, "We are facing an army that has everything: infinite ammunition, infinite fuel, infinite reserves. We have nothing." That was the turning point. The illusions shattered on the beaches of Normandy. By the end of the war, during the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive in the West in December 1944, the Wehrmacht fully understood who they were up against. The Germans threw about 400,000 men and 1,400 tanks into the attack. The Americans took the hit, even though it was powerful and unexpected. The Germans broke through, created a bulge, and surrounded several American units. But the Americans didn't run. They fought while surrounded, at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and several infantry units held for days without proper supplies. When asked to surrender, the acting commander, General McAuliffe, gave a one-word reply that became legendary. He said, "Nuts." The Germans didn't know what that meant. Someone had to translate. Then reserves arrived, fresh divisions, new equipment, and the offensive died. The Germans spent their last reserves, and the Americans barely noticed. American losses in the Bulge, about 80,000. They replaced them in a month. German losses, about 100,000, but there was nothing left to replace them with. The irony of this whole story is that the US really did fight differently from Germany. They didn't bet everything on fanaticism. They didn't demand that soldiers die for every inch of ground. They bet on industrial power, on logistics, on systemic superiority, on making sure the soldier had more bullets, more food, warmer jackets. And that model turned out to be deadly effective. Because in a long war, the winner isn't the one who fights the hardest on day 1. It's the one who still has tanks and fresh soldiers on year 2, 3, and 4. Here's a final fact. Over the whole war, the US lost about 400,000 dead. Germany lost about 5 million. Almost all of Germany's losses were on the Eastern Front. But if the Germans hadn't underestimated America, maybe they would have tried to negotiate with Stalin or shifted more forces west. No guarantee it would have saved them, but they would have had better odds. Instead, they just gave the Americans the time they needed to become unstoppable. The Germans underestimated the Americans not out of stupidity, not because they were bad at intelligence, but because it was comfortable to believe the lie. Goebbels' propaganda painted a cozy picture of a weak enemy. Old memories of WW1 suggested the Americans would show up late.
The first encounter at Kasserine seemed to confirm, yeah, they really don't know how to fight. Everything lined up into a single, neat, completely false picture. And when reality started tearing that picture apart, it was already too late to change the strategy. By the time the Germans realized the Americans had become deadly dangerous, the Americans already had 8 million soldiers, 50,000 tanks, 300,000 planes, and total air supremacy. And that, my friends, is what you call too little, too late. So here's the main takeaway. When you size up an opponent, don't look at their first fight. Don't laugh at their mistakes. Look at how fast they learn. Look at what they have behind them. Factories, schools, roads, ports. How many trucks do they have? How many new tanks can they build in a month? Because in a long war, the winner isn't the one who fights best on the first day. It's the one who is still standing on the last day. The Americans understood that. The Germans, unfortunately for them, didn't, and they paid for that mistake with everything: their army, their country, their history. And after the war, America became a superpower. Ironic, isn't it? That same nation of traitors that Hitler thought was weak turned out to be the force that finished off the Third Reich. Never judge strength by first impressions. War isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And in a marathon, the winner is the one with more factories and a faster ability to learn from their screw-ups. Keep that in mind.